What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph, and welcome back to Casually Competitive MTG, where it's our goal to bring you semi-competitive EDH gameplay content that is both fast-paced and entertaining. In this video, we brought back some fan favorites, some decks that haven't been seen in a while, and I think you'll like what we have in store for you today. And as you guys know, we stream these games over on our Twitch channel. In this upcoming Sunday, the 31st, we will be streaming with some of the guys from Playing with Power. So if that's something that interests you, check out the Twitch channel, and we'll actually be on their stream on their YouTube channel on this upcoming Saturday. But before we get into the opening hands and deck introductions, we have a few quick channel promotions. The first one being, if you want to rep some casually competitive merch, you want a backpack, a hat, some shirts, we have a merch store available at casuallycompetitivemtg.com. If you do want to help support us financially, we have a Patreon available. We think you'll enjoy the rewards, and we really do appreciate everyone who supports us in this way. It really does go a long way to help support the channel. Next, if you are going to be buying cards in the near future, we have a TCG affiliate link in the description. After clicking on that link, any purchases you make directly help the channel at no cost to you. And finally, if you want to join our community and get to know us a little better, we have a public Discord in the description available. Now with that out of the way, let's get into the opening hands and deck introductions. Going first today is Nate playing Zur the Enchanter, and this is a consultation-based build. Nate's goal with this deck is to play Zur early, get Necropotence on the battlefield or some other value engine that is tutorable with Zur, and eventually win through a Tainted Pact, Demonic Consultation, or Spoils of the Vault in combination with a Laboratory Maniac type effect. Nate's opening hand contained a Flooded Strand, a River of Tears, an Exotic Orchard, a Path to Exile, an Enlightened Tutor, a Swan Song, and a Brainstorm. Going second is Joseph playing the Gitrog Monster. The Gitrog Monster utilizes Dredge in order to pull off a semi-complicated or at least multi-stepped combo that essentially allows Joseph to utilize the card Dakmor Salvage in combination with the Gitrog Monster's ability and a discard outlet to draw his library and then win the game with his library in his hand. Joseph kept his second 7 today, and his opening hand contained a Tarnished Citadel, an Ancient Tomb, a Mana Vault, an Ebony Charm, a Cabal Ritual, an Abrupt Decay, and a Raminamp Excavator. Going third is Jordan playing the God-Eternal Kefnet. This deck looks to control the board being just mono blue and eventually win through infinite turns using Kefnet's ability to copy the first card that he draws every turn and then a top deck manipulation card like Jace the Mind Sculptor or Scroll Rack, with the combo being a way to put an extra turn spell back on top of his library and then he draws it every turn, copying it each time. Jordan's opening hand contained 2 snow-covered islands, a Gemstone Caverns, a Mana Crypt, a Mystic Remora, a Jace the Mind Sculptor, and a Temporal Manipulation. And finally, going last today is Bill playing Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. This graveyard-based combo deck looks to utilize its graveyard and generate infinite mana through something like a World Gorger Dragon and an Animate Dead in order to infinitely blink all of his permanents, and then he uses his commander, Kroxa, as an outlet by continually recasting him. There are backups in this deck, including an Underworld Breach, Lion's Eye Diamond, and Wheel of Fortune line that allows him to mill out his opponents. Bill's opening hand contained a Swamp, a Mountain, a Crow Mox, a Soul Ring, a Shenanigans, a Bottomless Pit, and a Toxic Deluge. Now with the opening hands and deck introductions out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. Before Nate takes his turn, Jordan has a pre-game action, and he puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield and exiles a snow-covered island, putting a luck counter on the caverns. Nate then goes to his turn, draws, plays a Flooded Strand, and then passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph draws, plays a Tarnished Citadel, and then taps it for a colorless mana to cast a Mana Vault. All through, he ships the turn to Jordan. Jordan draws, plays a snow-covered island, and then for 0 mana, casts a Mana Crypt. He then taps all of his mana sources to cast his commander, God-Eternal Kefnet. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill draws, plays a Mountain, and then for 0 mana casts a Crow Mox. When it enters the battlefield, he imprints a Bottomless Pit. He then taps for 2 mana to cast his commander, Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. When it enters the battlefield, each of his opponents are forced to discard. Nate discards a Pithing Needle, Joseph a Savage Summonings, and Jordan discards a snow-covered island, takes 3 damage due to discarding a land, and Bill decides to sacrifice Kroxa and return it to the command zone rather than his graveyard. Bill then goes to pass the turn to Nate, and on Bill's end step, Nate pays 1 life to crack his Flooded Strand to search up a Hollowed Fountain to the battlefield, paying 2 more life to have it enter untapped. He then taps the Hollowed Fountain for a white mana to cast an Enlightened Tutor. The Tutor resolves and he searches a Mystic Remora to the top of his library. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, plays an Exotic Orchard, and then taps for 1 mana to cast his Mystic Remora. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, plays an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn, and then taps his mana, taking 5 total damage to cast a Ramanamp Excavator. With nothing left, he goes to pass the turn to Jordan, and on Joseph's end step, Nate taps for a white mana to cast Path to Exile, targeting Jordan's commander. It resolves, Jordan searches up a snow-covered island to the battlefield, and then Jordan goes to his turn, and in his upkeep, loses his mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws, and then taps for 1 blue mana to cast his own Mystic Remora, and he decides to pay the 4 additional mana so Nate doesn't draw. In response to the Mystic Remora, Nate pays 2 life to cast a Mental Misstep, targeting the Remora, and the Remora is countered. With nothing left, Jordan gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, plays an Ancient Tomb, and then taps this Ancient Tomb, paying 2 life, along with his other mana sources, to recast his commander. It resolves. When it enters the battlefield, Nate discards a Pact of Negation, Joseph a Cabal Ritual, and Jordan a Cyclonic Rift. Bill then decides to put Kroxa back into the command zone due to the sacrifice clause, and Bill then gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep pays 1 mana to keep his fish around, and then draws a card for turn, plays a River of Tears, and immediately gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, plays a Forest as his land, and then goes to combat and swings his Excavator at Nate for 2 damage. Nate takes the damage, and Joseph gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and in his upkeep loses his mana Crypt trigger, takes 3 damage, draws his card for turn, and he then plays a tapped Mystic Sanctuary. He then taps for 4 mana to cast Jace the Mind Sculptor, not paying for the Remora, and Nate draws a card. It resolves, and he then activates Jace's +0 ability to essentially brainstorm. With nothing left, Jordan gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, plays a Swamp as his land for turn, and then taps his Ancient Tomb, paying 2 life to help cast a Soul Ring. It resolves, and he then again taps out completely to cast his commander for the 3rd time and for 6 mana. It resolves, and then in response to the ETB, Nate taps for 1 blue mana to cast a Brainstorm. He looks at the top 3 cards of his library, puts 2 back, and then everybody discards, Nate a Mox Opal, Joseph an Ebony Charm, and Jordan a Flusterstorm. This time, Bill decides to let Kroxa go to his graveyard, and then with nothing left, he gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep pays 2 mana to keep his Mystic Remora around for another turn. He then draws, plays a snow-covered island, and then taps for 1 blue mana to cast a Preordain. With the Preordain, he scries 1 card to the top, 1 to the bottom, and then draws the card he scried to the top. He then taps for 1 mana to cast a Soul Ring, and he then taps his Soul Ring to cast a Thought Vessel. With nothing left, he ships the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and then taps for 2 mana, taking 3 damage from the Citadel and 2 from the Ancient Tomb, to cast a Dark Confidant. He then goes to combat and swings his Excavator at Bill for 2 damage, and once the damage is dealt, he gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and in his upkeep wins his mana Crypt trigger, doesn't take any damage, draws his card for turn, and then taps his mana to recast his commander, God-Eternal Kefnet, for 6 mana. He then activates Jace's +0 ability to again essentially brainstorm, and he then gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and then taps his mana to cast an Exhume, not paying for Remora. Bill is the only person with creatures in his graveyard, so he essentially reanimates Kroxa to the battlefield, and when it enters the battlefield, each of his opponents discard a card. Nate discards a Rest in Peace, Joseph discards an Abrupt Decay, and Jordan discards a Temporal Manipulation. Since the escape cost was not paid, Kroxa does get sacrificed, and Bill again decides to put Kroxa into the graveyard. Bill then taps for 3 mana to cast a Toxic Deluge, not paying for Remora, and paying 5 life into the spell. It resolves, it wipes the board, and Bill then taps for 2 mana to cast a Shenanigans, taking 2 from his Ancient Tomb, to target Nate's Soul Ring, and when it resolves, the Soul Ring is destroyed. Causing enough destruction on this turn, Bill decides to pass the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep decides to again pay for fish and taps 3 mana to keep it around. He then draws, and with nothing to do, gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and then taps his mana, taking 3 damage from the Citadel to cast his commander, the Gitrog Monster. There are no responses, it resolves, and Joseph gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and in his upkeep loses his mana Crypt trigger, and he then draws a card for turn. He starts off this turn by activating Jace's +0 ability to essentially brainstorm, and he then taps for 3 mana to cast a Rhystic Study. He does not pay for Remora, Nate draws, and then the study resolves, and Jordan gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and then taps his mana to cast a Reanimate, targeting Joseph's Dark Confidant in his graveyard. he decides to pay all of his taxes and pays 5 additional mana, taking 2 damage from his Ancient Tomb, in order to negate the draws from Nate's and Jordan's permanents. He gets the Dark Confidant, loses 2 life when it enters the battlefield, and he then gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep decides he's not getting enough value and decides to not pay for Remora. He then draws, plays a Reliquary Tower as his land for turn, and then taps for 3 mana to cast a Blind Obedience, paying for the Rhystic Study tax. He then goes to pass the turn to Joseph, and on Nate's end step, Jordan taps for 1 blue mana to cast a Chain of Vapor, targeting the Gitrog Monster. The Gitrog Monster gets bounced, Joseph decides to not copy the spell, and Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, takes 1 damage from Mana Vault in his draw step, and then, with nothing to do, gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and again loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws, activates Jace's +0 ability, and then has to give the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and in his upkeep reveals a Mausoleum Secrets off of the Dark Confidant's trigger, taking 2 damage. He then draws and taps for 3 mana to cast a Talisman of Indulgence, paying for Rhystic Study. Due to the Blind Obedience, it enters tapped, and he then pays 3 mana to cast a Mausoleum Secrets, making sure to pay for the Rhystic Study to search up a 1 CMC black card to his hand. He decides to get Vampiric Tutor, and he then gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, plays a Snow-Covered Swamp, and then taps his mana to cast his commander, Zur the Enchanter, paying for Rhystic Study. In response to Zur, Jordan taps his mana to cast a War of Invention X equaling 1, floating a colorless mana. He gets a Soul Ring to the battlefield, and then still in response to the Zur cast, he taps for 2 mana to cast a Delay, targeting the Zur. Delay resolves, and Zur gets suspended with 3 time counters on it. With nothing left, Nate gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, takes 1 damage from Mana Vault in his draw step, draws his card, and then plays a Nurturing Peatland as his land for turn. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Squandered Resources, taking 1 damage from the Peatland, 2 from the Ancient Tomb, in order to pay for the Rhystic Study. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, again loses his Mana Crypt trigger, and then draws a card for turn. He starts off the turn by activating Jace's +0 ability, and he then plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land for turn, and then for 0 mana casts a Mox Opal. He then taps his mana to cast a Time Stretch. There are no responses to Time Stretch, and Jordan gives the turn to himself. Jordan, on his next turn, untaps, in his upkeep wins this Mana Crypt trigger, and then draws a card for turn. He plays a Cavern of Souls as his land for turn, and when it enters the battlefield, he names God. He then casts his commander for the 3rd time this game, and due to the Cavern of Souls, it is uncounterable. He then again activates Jace's +0 ability, and then for 1 blue mana, casts an Opt. He scries a card to the bottom, draws a card, and then taps for 3 mana to cast a Back to Basics. In response to the Back to Basics, Bill for 0 mana casts a Slaughter Pact, targeting God-Eternal Kefnet. He taps his Ancient Tomb for mana, taking 2 damage to pay for the Rhystic Study tax, and then the Slaughter Pact resolves, killing Kefnet, and Jordan gives a turn to himself again. On this 3rd turn, Jordan wins his Mana Crypt trigger in his upkeep, draws, plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land, again activates Jace's +0 ability, and then taps for 3 mana to cast a Windfall. In response to the Windfall, Nate taps for 2 mana to cast a Cyclonic Rift, targeting Jordan's Back to Basics. He does not pay for Rhystic Study, and then in response to the Cyclonic Rift, Jordan taps for a blue mana to cast a Rapid Hybridization, targeting Bill's reanimated Dark Confidant. The Rapid Hybridization resolves, and the Cyclonic Rift resolves, bouncing back to basics. Still in response to the original Windfall cast, Joseph taps for 1 green mana to cast a Nature's Claim, targeting Jordan's Rhystic Study. He does not pay the extra, Jordan draws, and then in response to the Nature's Claim, Jordan taps his mana to cast a Reality Shift, targeting the newly acquired 3/3 beast on Bill's board. Reality Shift resolves, Bill manifests the top card of his library, and then Nature's Claim resolves, destroying Rhystic Study, gaining Jordan 4 life, and then the Windfall finally resolves, everybody discards their hand and draws 2 cards. Joseph did decide to put Gitrog back into the command zone when it was discarded. With nothing left, Jordan gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps and in his upkeep pays the mana in order to not lose the game off of the Slaughter Pact. He then draws and taps for 4 mana and exiles 5 cards from his graveyard in order to cast Kroxa, casting it using the escape cost. When it enters the battlefield, his opponents discard a card. Nate discards an Angel's Grace, Joseph a Gemstone Caverns, taking 3 damage, and Jordan an Ancient Tomb, also taking 3 damage. Now, one thing to note here is that we did momentarily for a turn cycler to forget about the Blind Obedience, so Kroxa does not enter tapped here. It does not make a huge difference for now. I just want to point it out. Anyway, once Kroxa enters the battlefield, Bill goes to combat and swings his 2/2 Manifest at Jace. Jace takes the damage, and Bill gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep removes a time counter from the suspended Zur. He then draws and for 1 mana casts a Grafdigger's Cage, paying additional mana to extort it with Blind Obedience. All of Nate's opponents take 1 damage, Nate gains 3, the Grafdiggers resolves, and Nate gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, takes a damage from Mana Vault in his draw step, draws, and then plays a Strip Mine as his land for turn. Joseph then taps all of his mana and sacrifices Strip Mine to squandered resources to generate an additional colorless to recast his commander, the Gitrog Monster. Again, this should enter the battlefield tapped. He then plays a second land for turn, being Verdant Catacombs, and then gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and in his upkeep loses his mana crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then taps his mana to recast an uncounterable Kefnet, which again does resolve and should enter the battlefield tapped due to the Blind Obedience. He then activates Jace's +0 ability to Brainstorm yet again, and then plays a snow-covered island as his land for turn. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and then goes to combat, swinging Kroxa at Jace. Now, this is where the Forgetfulness on the Blind Obedience comes into play. We do notice this in just a little while, but for a few minutes here, Kroxa and the Manifest token will both be tapped, because Bill was thinking he needed to get through with blockers. However, we realize this mistake in just a little bit, and he does end up just swinging Kroxa. On attack, Bill's opponents each discard a card, Nate a Swan Song, Joseph nothing since he has no cards in hand, and takes 3 damage, and Jordan and Academy Ruins also taking 3 damage. The Kroxa then goes through, Jace is destroyed, and Bill then gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep removes another time counter from his suspended Zur. He then draws and goes to give the turn to Joseph, and on Nate's end step, Joseph pays 1 life to crack his Verdant Catacombs, drawing a card when it hits the graveyard, and then searches up a swamp to the battlefield. Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, and in his upkeep sacrifices his Tarnished Citadel due to the Gitrog trigger, draws a card when it hits the graveyard, and then in his draw step loses 1 for Mana Vault, and then draws a card for turn. He then plays a Cavern of Souls as his land for turn, and names Elf when it enters. He then taps the Cavern of Souls for a green mana to cast a Boreal Druid. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage, and he then draws a card for turn, and realizing he has no plays to make, passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and then goes to combat, swinging Kroxa at Nate. On attack, each of Bill's opponents are forced to discard. Nate discards a Mana Confluence, taking 3, Joseph a Necropotence, and Jordan an Elite Arcanist. Bill then taps his mana to cast a Ransack the Labs, looks at 3 cards, puts a World Gorger and a Cursed Totem into his graveyard, plays a Reflecting Pool as his land for turn, and he then taps for 2 mana to cast a Shenanigans, targeting Nate's Grafdigger's Cage. In response to the Shenanigans, Jordan taps for 2 blue mana to cast a Narset's Reversal, targeting the Shenanigans, returning it to Bill's hand, and then with his own copy targets Bill's Crow Mox. In response to this copy, Bill taps his Crow Mox for a black mana, the Crow Mox is then destroyed, and he then taps his mana to recast Shenanigans, again targeting Grafdiggers. This time it resolves, Grafdiggers is destroyed, and then for 2 mana, Bill casts Dance of the Dead, targeting his World Gorger Dragon in his graveyard. The Dance of the Dead resolves, and then World Gorger enters the battlefield. Now, in response to the ETB on the World Gorger, Joseph sacrifices his Cavern of Souls for mana in order to draw a card when it hits the graveyard. He then decides to sacrifice his Ancient Tomb to squandered resources to generate a colorless mana and then draw a card when it hits the graveyard. He then taps and sacks his Forest, generating another card draw and mana, and he then uses 1 of his green mana to cast a Noxious Revival, targeting the Nature's Claim in his graveyard. Noxious Revival resolves, Nature's Claim goes to the top of his library, and he then pays 1 of the colorless mana and taps his Nurtured Peatland in order to sacrifice it, and he draws 2 cards, 1 from the Peatland activation and 1 from the Gitrog trigger when it hits the graveyard. He He then uses another one of his floating green to cast his Nature's Claim, targeting Dance of the Dead. Dance of the Dead is destroyed, Bill gains 4 life, and since Dance of the Dead is removed, the World Gorger Dragon leaves the battlefield, returning all of the exiled permanents, which there are none of, and then the ETB of the World Gorger Dragon resolves, exiling all of Bill's permanents, and then Bill gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep removes the last time counter from Zur, casts it for free, and decides to pay an additional mana in order to extort it, dealing 1 damage to each of his opponents and gaining 3. He then goes to combat, and since Zur has haste due to how the suspend and delay works, he swings Zur at Joseph. On attack, searching up a Necropotence to the battlefield, Joseph takes the 1 damage, and in his second main phase, Nate pays 18 life into Necropotence in order to exile 18 cards face down, and he then goes to his end step, puts those cards to his hand, and since he has no max hand size, he gets to keep all of those cards, and Joseph then goes to his turn. Joseph untaps and in his upkeep sacrifices his last land to the Gitrog trigger. He draws a card when it hits the graveyard and then goes to his draw step, taking 1 from Mana Vault and then drawing for turn. He plays an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth as his land and then taps for 2 mana to cast a Demonic Tutor. In response to the tutor, Nate taps for 2 blue mana to cast a Counterspell. Counterspell resolves, the tutor is countered, and then Joseph sacrifices the Urborg for a black mana in order to draw a card. He then pays 2 life to shock in an Overgrown Tomb, and then for 0 mana casts a Chrome Mox. When it enters, he imprints Gitrog Tree Speaker, and he then goes to combat and swings Gitrog at Nate. Nate takes the damage, and Joseph gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, wins his Mana Crypt trigger, and then draws his card for turn. He also goes to combat and swings Kefnet at Nate for 4 more damage. Nate takes the damage, and Jordan then taps his mana to cast Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. In response to Jace, Nate taps for 2 blue mana to cast Mana Drain. The Mana Drain resolves, and Jordan gives the turn to Bill. Bill doesn't untap anything, draws, and with nothing to do, gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, and in his first main phase gets 4 colorless mana from the Mana Drain. He then, in his first main phase, casts his own Demonic Tutor, which resolves, so he searches up a card to his hand, and he then goes to combat and swings Zur at Bill. On attack, he searches up a Phyrexian Unlife to the battlefield. Bill then takes the 1 Zur damage, and in his second main phase, Nate plays a Forbidden Orchard as his land for turn, and then taps for 2 mana to cast a Thassa's Oracle. There are no responses to the Oracle, and in response to the ETB, Nate taps for 1 black mana to cast a Spoils of the Vault. In response to the Spoils cast, Joseph taps his Overgrown Tomb for a green and then sacrifices it for a black in order to draw, and then passes priority on the Spoils of the Vault. The Spoils of the Vault resolves, Nate names a card that is not in his library, and he then essentially exiles his entire library since he doesn't lose the game for being at 0 life due to Phyrexian Unlife, and then, when his library is gone, the Thassa's Oracle ETB resolves and Nate wins the game. Now, I do want to say a few things about this game because I found this game fairly interesting like I do with most of our games, but a few spots in this game specifically I want to talk about. The first one being why I didn't cast Gitrog earlier this game, even though I could have had a very early Gitrog, turn 3 or turn 2 if I had pulled the right land. But the reason I held off on playing the Gitrog, even though it would have gotten me some value, was that I was very scared of what Bill can do. Throughout the game, other than a few interactions, I really didn't feel confident that either Nate or Jordan had enough interaction to stop Bill if he did try to go off, and I pulled that Nature's Claim on turn 1, so I was really relying on that Nature's Claim in order to save the game. This Kroxa deck is known to go off very early, and since I kept a hand of 7 that was decent, it had some decent control in it, it really wasn't anything that was going to propel me forward by playing Gitrog, so I wanted to keep the card in hand that would let me save the game if Bill did try to go off, and it would also have saved me if Nate tried to go off early through using a Phyrexian Unlife, or something like a Solitary Confinement if he was trying to just turtle up. So because of that, I did not want to tap my only green sources in order to cast Gitrog until I was sure that at least I'd be safe for another turn cycle, and it didn't really happen until I believe it was turn 5. Now looking back at the game, Bill did not have the cards in hand that he would have needed in order to win, but even playing Gitrog early in that position, I still think I would have gotten hated out a little bit too much, and I think Gitrog would have just been removed a little early, and I would have lost the ability to have that piece of control and have Gitrog on the battlefield, so I felt like waiting was the best option. So that's my reasoning for playing Gitrog a little bit late. And another thing I want to talk about is why I dug so deep on trying to stop Bill, even though in hindsight it kind of did just give Nate the win since he was just next in line at that point. And the reason is because of the first few cards that I drew off of sacking those lands. Now, I don't like playing Kingmaker. If I can stop someone, but immediately that gives the next person in turn order the chance to win that I can't stop, and especially knowing that Jordan had nothing because I believe he had 0 cards in hand, it really makes things weird because if I can't do anything, I'm basically giving Nate the win. However, the first 2 cards that I pulled from sacrificing those lands were a Demonic Tutor and a Chrome Mox, and I felt like if I could just go one deeper and find the card I need in order to stop Bill, if I get these spells resolved, I have a chance to go off on my turn if Gitrog stays on the battlefield. So it was a bit of a risk, but I did have a line there. I had Gitrog on the battlefield, Demonic Tutor in hand, some free mana with the Chrome Mox, and I was going to draw a card for turn. I had the tools I needed in order to get there. Unfortunately, Zur was going to resolve since no one could really do anything about it, and my hope was that he kind of just fizzled. I knew he was going to draw a lot of cards since there wasn't a lot of damage on the board, but I was hoping he just didn't pull the right counter spells to stop what I was trying to do. Unfortunately, he did, but I did have a line there, and I thought that that line was worth trying to stop Bill for, even though it did set Nate up for kind of an easy victory past that. Anyway, I wanted to explain my point of view really quickly at the end of the game since, that's what this section of the video is for. But that being said, that is all we have for this video. We hope you did enjoy it. I am Joseph, this is Casually Competitive MTG, and we will see you next time.